Hello and welcome to another video. Today I'll be walking you through how I made these early 1830s stays. These are the first piece in a larger 1830s ensemble, so make sure to keep your eyes peeled for that. Please note that this is not a tutorial. I'm not claiming to know what to do here. At all. But if you're like me, sometimes you just like to watch someone mess around. Please also forgive my issues with lighting and camera angles. I'm learning how to do this filming thing, and it's quite challenging. Alright, let's get started. The first step in any project is always a pattern of some sort, which, as you can see, I laid out over my fabric and traced. You of course can design your own, but this time I opted to use someone else's expertise, Black Snail. There'll be a link to this pattern in the description. This is my first time using one of their patterns and it was a wonderful experience. As with any pattern, make sure that you take your measurements accurately and certainly don't be afraid to make your own modifications. As you can see, I started by cutting out the lining. For the lining, I used the softest cotton I could find, which is actually a recycled piece of fabric. There's really not much to say here. I traced out my patterns onto 2 layers of fabric to create matching pieces, with the notable exception of the centerpiece, which is 1 cut on the fold, and the bust gussets cut over 4 layers to create 4 pieces. And there's nothing fancy here. I used a pen to trace and my fabric scissors as weights. Then, once that was done, I removed the pattern, pinned the 2 layers together so they wouldn't shift, and cut everything out. After this, I pressed each piece to remove any wrinkles. You'll see my iron eventually in this video, and you'll understand then why I don't show it on camera very often. Old is the understatement of the century. Next, I transferred the necessary markings for the gusset vents to the wrong side of the lining fabric. I do this with the right sides of the matching pieces pinned together so that when I cut into the fabric I create identical vents on each piece. There are 6 vents in total, 2 on either side for each of the hip gussets and 2 pairs for each bust cup. After this, I folded and pressed about 1/8 of an inch on either side of the cut towards the wrong side of the fabric. Again, you're not seeing my iron, but this was the result. Feel free to measure this part if you want, but I trust my ability to eyeball. After that, I was ready to put in my gussets. I pinned the right side of each gusset to the wrong side of the lining. The turned over edge of the vent should be 3/8 of an inch from the edge of the gusset. Again, you can measure this, and the pattern even provides a marked stitching line, but for me, I can usually eyeball 3/8 of an inch quite easily. After this, I top stitched along the turned over edge of the gusset, keeping as close as I could to the edge, about 1/16 of an inch. Where the 2 edges of the vent meet at the bottom of the V shape created by the inserted gusset, I used my machine to create a very rough bar tack. On the outer fabric, I did these by hand. I repeated these steps with all of the gussets. Now it was just a matter of sewing each of the lining pieces together using a 5/8 inch seam allowance. As these seams are curved, I eased as necessary. After pressing the seam allowances towards the center back, I top stitched them in place. With the lining done, I was able to repeat all the previous steps with the fashion fabric. For this, I chose a natural colored off-white sort of cotton. As it's canvas, it's very thick and has virtually no natural stretch. As a result, cotton canvas is a favorite go-to for corsetry for me. Again, I cut out and pressed each piece, then marked and opened the vents. After this, I pressed the seam allowances for each vent. Due to this cotton's delicious sort of thickness, this was a little more challenging than it was with the lining. With the lining, I showed you what the hip vents look like pressed open. These are the bust gussets, pressed and ready. Then I inserted the gussets as usual and stitched. At this point, though I'd finally managed a better camera angle, my sewing machine decided that she didn't want to sew any straight lines, so there's a bit of a wobble especially on the bust gussets. But really, what can you do? With the gussets in, I stitched each piece together. Again, the thickness of the fabric had an effect, in this case making easing a little more difficult than it had been in the lining. However, it was still very straightforward. With the whole piece assembled, I pressed the seam allowances, this time towards the center front of the garment, which is the opposite of the lining, and top stitched the seam allowances down. Attaching the lining to the fashion fabric was a simple affair. With right sides together, I stitched the 2 together along the center back. I trimmed away the excess seam allowance, turned the whole thing right side out, and pressed. At this point, I skipped ahead a bit and made the boning channels on either side of the center back, using a 3/8 of an inch channel for a 1/4 inch bone, and then I slipped the bones in. Subsequently, I attached the straps with the pattern's sturdy suggestion. It's a little hard to explain, but essentially I made a sandwich as follows. From top to bottom, the wrong side of the fashion strap up, its right side against the fashion fabric's right side. Under this, the wrong side of the lining fabric already joined to the wrong side of the fashion fabric. Then the right side of the lining against the right side of the lining strap, with the lining strap's wrong side on the very bottom. I sewed all of this together with that 5/8 an inch seam allowance, flipped the strap pieces up, and matched their wrong sides together. Phew! Ta-da! Now it was time for something that I don't usually do. Basting. I felt like a proper sewist as I basted down the top and bottom edges to keep the lining and the fashion fabric together. With everything secured by basting stitches, it was time for my absolute favorite part, boning and cording. I marked the channels for the busk and bones first, using tailor's chalk. When I work with something that's going to be covered, I usually don't hesitate to use pen or pencil, but as this is the outermost layer, I played it safe and used chalk. Each bone received a 3/8 of an inch channel, and the busk got 2 inches. I ended up later reducing the busk channel width as it was too big and not quite tight enough. I did this by adding a piece of cording on either side, and ta-da! Historically accurate and much better. Marking out the channels for the cording was a bit more of a lengthy process, as there are a great deal more of them and they have curves. Using a combination of careful measuring, lining up the matching pieces frequently to get as much of a mirror image as possible, and erasing as necessary, I got cording channels that I was happy with. Each one is about 1/8 of an inch wide, and this took me a very, very long time. Then came time for trapunto, which frightened me at first and has fascinated me since. Here's how I did it. The first step was to make a small hole on the end of the channel, inside the lining. You'll see I'm using embroidery scissors to do this, but an awl would be the weapon of choice for most. However, I'm not actually cutting the lining, merely stretching the individual threads to create a hole. This is very easy with an old fabric, as it has lost its natural tightness and stretch. Then I used this needle, and I think it's called a packing needle, to guide the cording through. The cording is 2 millimeters, about 1/16 of an inch wide, and made of twisted cotton strands. On the other side of the channel, I was able to use the needle the way one would use an awl. Most of the time, I used a pair of pliers to help tug the needle through, as this can require quite a bit of physical strength. Again, I'm not showing you much of this, but this is what took the majority of my time. I did, however, find it intensely soothing and enjoyed it immensely. Then it was time to mark the eyelets and punch them. I made an opening using embroidery scissors, again an awl would have been more typical, and then widened it with a very special tool that's actually not designed for sewing. It's a hair fork. I genuinely just take it out of my hair, use it to widen the hole, and put it right back in. It's an example of using what you have. Of course, a knitting needle, a pencil, a chopstick, etc. will work just as well. Then I worked the eyelets in the normal way, using embroidery thread. You guessed it, now it's busk time. For this, I brought in an expert to make me one, my dad. It's a simple process, apparently, if you happen to be the kind of person who has precisely the right thickness of poplar scrap around. He sawed it down to the right length, used a belt sander to trim it to the correct width, marked the appropriate curves, and sanded and beveled the edges. Then he used very fine sandpaper to do a final workup and create a delightfully smooth busk. Thanks, Dad. After this, I made a pocket for the busk. This was quite easy. I clipped the lining, turned it inward, and whipped it to the outside, catching only the innermost threads. Unfortunately, I didn't film putting in the bar tacks by hand with embroidery thread, but it's much the same principle as an eyelet. Here's a picture of a finished tack. I absolutely should have done this before attaching the lining, but did I? Absolutely not. The bar tacks do have a purpose, and that is to strengthen the base of each gusset and cover any flaws therein. They're very pretty, but given the thickness of the canvas, absolutely miserable to do. As an apology for the gap in my records, please accept a picture of my cat sitting atop my half-finished stays. Now it was time to bind, and for this I must ask you, do you hate sewing? No? Then bind anything and I promise you will. I made my own binding out of the cotton canvas to ensure it matched. Of course, you can use pre-made bias tape or even ribbon. This is extremely easy to do, however. You determine your desired width, for me it was 1/4 of an inch, and multiply it by 4. You'll notice I cut this on the straight grain and not on the bias, and there are a few reasons for this. First, it's easier. It's also more fabric efficient. And as I don't need bias stretch the way I would if I were binding 18th century stays, which is hell, thank you for asking, this was completely justifiable. Then I turned the edges inward to meet and pressed them flat. Here's my ironing setup, and this is why I don't show it off. I do own an ironing board, but it's in the basement and I don't really want to lug it upstairs. I don't actually own a more modern iron, but this one gets the job done. Now here is where I saved myself a little bit of effort. Matching the edge of my stays to the inner edge of the folded binding, I pinned and then top stitched it in place. After this, I turned the binding over the raw edge and clipped it in place. These are binder clips, but you can use fancy sewing clips or pins. I don't have sewing clips, and trying to send a pin through this many layers of canvas actually made my hands bleed, so voila, binder clips. Next, I whip-stitched the canvas to the lining. Sounds quick, but it isn't. I'm just thankful these are 19th century stays and not 18th century ones with all those little tabs. The final step was fan lacing. Here's how it looks all done. I didn't film this process because I cannot emphasize how little I knew what I was doing. However, it was quite simple. I crisscrossed the laces and fastened each end to a tab. Then, to put them on or take them off, all I have to do is tie the tabs together at the front, and it creates a perfect fit every time. After a final modification, which was adding in that extra cording to decrease the size of the busk channel to minimize creasing, my 1830s stays were done. And that's all. I had a blast making these stays and can't wait to show you the rest of the project. If you'd like to support me, feel free to like this video, subscribe, and interact with me on the other socials. You can join me on Instagram and TikTok, and even buy me a coffee. Take care, and see you next time.